When Dave and Mary Neese realized their 16-year-old daughter Skylar wasn't home, their first thought was not that something had happened to her. They figured she was with friends. As it turned out, they were both right and wrong. I'm Chris, and this is True Crime Recaps. Skylar's parents left for work early that morning on Friday, July 6, 2012. It was Dave who came home first around midday so Skylar could use his car to get to her part-time job at Wendy's. But he walked into a quiet apartment, an empty apartment. He poked his head into his daughter's room, but she wasn't there. Where had she gone? Their place was on the ground floor, and when he noticed her window was open, a shiver of fear ran up his spine. And just to make sure she was safe, he gave Skylar's best friend, Sheila Eddy, a call to find out if she'd seen her or knew where she was. Sheila and Skylar had been friends since they were 8 years old. She was practically a second daughter to Dave and Mary. The girls had grown up together near Morgantown, West Virginia. Now they were both sophomores at the same high school. And Skylar made a point of looking out for Sheila, who could be a little wild and irresponsible. And the Neese family apartment was her home away from home. She didn't even need to knock when she came over. She always just walked right in. But on the phone that day, Sheila told him she didn't know any more than he did. She said the last time she talked to Skylar was the night before, around midnight. So now he was starting to get really worried. All her life, Skylar had been a daddy's girl, and he was incredibly proud of the woman she was growing up to be. She was on the honor roll and worked hard to keep up her straight A's. And she wasn't just brilliant. She was loving and sweet, and she never gave them cause to worry. Not really. When his wife Mary got home, Dave told her what was going on. They were just about to call Wendy's to find out if she was at work, but before they could, they got a call from her manager. And he wanted to know if Skylar was coming in. She was late for her shift. That's when they called 911. Dialing those 3 numbers is a parent's nightmare, but it was about to get worse. Because the next time the phone rang, it was Sheila Eddy calling them back. And she said she had a confession to make. She told them Skylar snuck out the night before around 11 p.m. Sheila said they hung out for about an hour, and she dropped Skylar off at home later. Well, not actually at the apartment. She claimed Skylar wanted her to drop her off down the street so she didn't get in trouble if her parents heard or saw the car. She said she'd walk the rest of the way, and according to Sheila, that was the last time she saw her. When Dave and Mary took a look outside Skylar's bedroom window, they found a small stool from her room right underneath the ledge. It was pretty obvious she used it to sneak out, but apparently she never came in again. So, was Sheila telling the truth? Had someone snatched their daughter on her way back inside? When the cops came, they were sympathetic, but they told Dave and Mary they couldn't do anything more than listen. Not yet, anyway. Since she snuck out on her own, there was no proof anything sinister had happened. They figured she just had run away. As far as they knew, she might be back any minute. But they suggested asking their neighbors if they saw anything weird. By now, Sheila and her parents had joined Dave, Mary, and the police officer. Together, they walked around and questioned the neighbors, but no one saw anything of interest. Eventually, they went to apartment security and looked at the video footage from the various cameras around the parking lots. Right there, in gritty black and white footage at around 12:30 a.m., they saw a car pull up near the apartment. They watched as Skylar ran over and hopped in the back seat. It was the last time she'd ever be seen alive. At the sight of Skylar voluntarily getting into a car that night, the cops were more sure than ever that she'd be back. They told the Neeses to give it a couple of days, but they knew their daughter. They didn't believe she'd run away. But what was the alternative? It was better to think she was making them worry on purpose rather than assume something terrible had happened to her. So they waited. Skylar had big hopes, big dreams. She wanted to be a criminal lawyer. Ever since she could crawl, she'd been precocious and rambunctious. As she grew older, that boisterous behavior evolved into a big, bright personality. When she was in the room, you knew it. People loved being around her, and in their very first year of high school, she and Sheila made fast friends with another girl their age, Rachel Schoaf. Rachel was part of several different cliques in school, from the drama students to the religious crowd, and she was popular. When she found Sheila and Skylar, there was an instant connection. However, as time went on, there was a shift in their relationship. Sheila had been Skylar's best friend for a while now, but she was starting to hang out with Rachel more. Then, Skylar found out why their dynamic had changed. In September 2011, the three of them had a sleepover at Sheila's house. It started out normal, drinking, joking, having fun. But as the night got later, things between Sheila and Rachel started to heat up. Skylar had to sit awkwardly in the bedroom while Sheila and Rachel had sex. She wanted to leave, but Sheila's mom was out in the living room and Skylar couldn't sneak past her without prompting a lot of questions. And she didn't want to get her friends in trouble. But by the time the sleepover ended, Skylar and Sheila were fighting. Things began to change after that. Skylar started to notice just how different she was compared to the other two. Sheila and Rachel dressed alike and didn't tell Skylar. They had inside jokes and seemed determined to leave her out. And then there was all the sex stuff. And it wasn't just the experimenting they were doing together. They were sexually active with their boyfriends too. As time went on, Skylar started to feel like a little sister or a third wheel just tagging along. This caused a lot of tension and resentment. Skylar fought with Sheila more often, sometimes in person, sometimes on Twitter. But you know how it is with a friend you grew up with. It's hard to break those bonds, and the girls had been practically like sisters. To try and mend their relationship, Skylar and Sheila took a trip to Myrtle Beach together with their families, but they ended up spending the whole week fighting. By the spring of 2012, things between them had definitely changed. There was even talk that Rachel and Sheila were saying horrible, crazy stuff behind Skylar's back. Bizarre statements like how they had to get rid of Skylar. Sheila was obsessed about killing her. Later, Rachel would say she'd been talking about murder ever since that sleepover in the fall of 2011. Classmates overheard the girls talking a lot about how to dispose of a body, killing Skylar, and debating different ways they could do it. But they thought they were joking. After all, the three of them were still hanging out together. But they weren't kidding around. What Skylar didn't know was that Rachel and Sheila were just pretending to be friends with her. In actuality, they were actively planning her murder for months. Then, on July 6, 2012, Sheila and Rachel picked her up outside her apartment at 12:31 a.m. Here's what happened next. The three of them drove an hour out of town to a place in the woods where they felt safe. They'd been there before to drink and smoke pot. And that was what they planned to do that night, or at least that's what they told Skylar. It seemed like a fun hangout, and Skylar happily snuck out for a chance to reconnect with her friends. But she didn't know Sheila had 2 kitchen knives with her, and Rachel had brought a shovel and cleaning supplies. When Skylar turned to go back to the car for a lighter, they counted to 3 and stabbed her over and over. Skylar ran, but Rachel tackled her. She tried to fight back. She'd always been a fighter, and she got 1 blow in, even when she was on the ground. Rachel was cut just above the ankle, but Skylar was overpowered and outnumbered. Later, the girls claimed they only stopped stabbing after her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. They planned to bury her out there, but there were too many rocks and they couldn't dig, so they just covered her body with whatever happened to be around. Afterward, they drove back to town and acted as if nothing had happened. The very next day, Rachel went off to church camp for 2 weeks, and Sheila was at Skylar's house pretending to help Dave and Mary find their only child. And from then on, she inserted herself into the investigation often. But she didn't seem to care too much about her missing friend. You could say she was taking it in stride and trying to live her life like she hadn't just murdered her. Meanwhile, Rachel was more affected by what they had done than Sheila was. Her parents noticed she was becoming more and more erratic, and she tried to distance herself from the investigation and anything that had to do with Skylar. But before the murder, the girls hadn't been shy about the crazy comments they were making. All the stuff they'd said about killing her came back to haunt them. People started publicly accusing them of doing something to Skylar. And by late December 2012, 6 months after the murder, Rachel was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Her parents decided Sheila was the problem, and they told her she couldn't spend time with her anymore. But she wasn't willing to give her up. The fight turned physical, the police were called, and she was checked into a psych ward. 5 days after she was admitted, she was released. The next stop was the police station, where she was scheduled to have an interview with investigators. They hadn't even gotten a couple of questions in before Rachel broke down saying, "We did it. We stabbed her." And when they asked her why she did it, she said, "We just didn't like her anymore." Rachel led them to the place they killed her, but when they got there, it had just snowed and she couldn't quite pinpoint where they'd put the body. So they had to wait for the snow to melt. In the meantime, investigators wanted a confession from Sheila, too. At that point, the only evidence they had against her was Rachel's statements, so they set up a sting. Unfortunately, Rachel couldn't get her to admit anything. And 2 weeks later, after the snow had melted, police went back to the area to look for Skylar's body, but they didn't find anything. Was Rachel lying to them? Was this some kind of prank or stunt? Then they found her. An investigator picked up a GPS tracker that had fallen off of one of the dogs, and right there, under a pile of branches, were her skeletal remains. Over the next couple of months, Rachel and Sheila were allowed to walk around as if nothing was wrong. But behind the scenes, the cops were gathering evidence. They collected all the knives from Sheila's house. They searched her car and found a teeny bit of blood in the trunk. Meanwhile, the girls were homeschooled, but they were allowed on social media. In April 2013, Sheila made an inside joke about the murder on Twitter. She wrote, "We really did go on 3." Not long after she posted that, the police finally let the cat out of the bag and told the public that Skylar's body had been found. When the news came out, both Rachel and Sheila tweeted that they were glad Skylar might get justice. Sheila even said, "Rest easy, Skylar. You'll always be my best friend." But the game was over. 2 weeks later, on May 1st, 2013, Rachel turned herself in. She pled guilty to murder and agreed to testify against Sheila. Sheila was arrested later that day while she and her mom were out at dinner, but she insisted she didn't do it. It took another 8 months for her to change her plea to guilty. And she got life in prison. Rachel was sentenced to 30 years, and thank God they're both still in prison in West Virginia today. Because of what happened to Skylar and how her disappearance was treated, the Amber Alert system changed for the better. Her father wanted to make sure of that. The Skylar law ensured an Amber Alert is issued when a minor is missing, even when the police think they've run away. And that's your recap. Thank you so much for watching. If you like getting all the crime in half the time, let us know by giving this a thumbs up and hitting subscribe and the bell so you never miss a story. Amy and I are here every week with new recaps. Until next time, take care.